Hey everybody, today I am responding to a video by Dan McClellan that he posted a couple months ago, and in this video Dan is critiquing Inspiring Philosophy, or IP, for a video that Inspiring Philosophy had posted in which he was claiming that, or defending the idea that Luke did not make an error in Luke 2 in his comments about the census of Quirinius. And so in this video I'm going to be critiquing Dan's critique of that Inspiring Philosophy video. I'm doing this because somebody requested it from me in my comments. I don't always do the things you guys request me to do in the comments, but this time, yeah, this guy won. So I do want to make a small side comment before we get in here. I realized afterwards, I'm recording this opening after I've done the editing for the rest of it. I realized that for some reason, that I don't know why, I mispronounced one of the scholars' names that I mention frequently. I say Hofner. It's supposed to be Honer, I think is how you pronounce it. I don't know where I got that F from. So anyways, I wanted to make that comment right up here on the front. What I'm going to do is every time I mention him, I'm going to put one of these on the screen. That way you can know that if you're wanting to check that source. But anyways, yeah, I made that blunder. But besides that, I hope you guys enjoy this video. Let's go ahead and roll and get into it.
Supposed biblical error, the census of Luke.
All right, let's see it.
Skeptics will usually assert four problems. 1. In a Roman census, Joseph would not have to travel to Bethlehem, but could register at his current residency, and Mary would not have to register at all. 2. No Roman census would have been conducted while Herod the Great ruled until 4 BC. 3. There was never a single census conducted of the entire Roman Empire. It was done in sections. And finally, Quirinius was not governor until 6 AD. Jesus was born while Herod the Great reigned, which lasted until 4 BC. Thus, it could not be the census of Quirinius, conducted from 6 to 7 AD. Let's answer these in reverse. Starting with the last one, we did a separate video on Quirinius, where we pointed out there was a lot of evidence in the works of Josephus that Josephus may have been the one who misstated this census, and it actually should be dated back to the time when Herod the Great was alive.
So that other video is almost 40 minutes long, and it makes the argument that it is plausible that Josephus misdated the census of Quirinius based on another argument that it's plausible that two different Judases mentioned by Josephus are actually the same Judas. Now, none of these arguments actually rise above mere plausibility.
All right, so let's stop here. So Dan makes the claim that these arguments don't rise above plausibility, but if that is true, that's fine. IP, nor any other Christian, needs to go beyond showing plausibility in responding to Dan's use of the census. You see, Dan is making an assertion that Luke contains an error. Luke got something wrong. And he is citing Luke's comments about the census as evidence as supporting his claim. And if Inspiring Philosophy can offer an explanation of that data that is plausible, then that serves as an undercutting defeater for Dan's argument. IP does not have to show that it was for sure the case, or more likely the case, that this is what happened. To give a brief analogy, suppose that Bob is accused of a murder and he's on trial. Suppose the prosecutor comes out and says that Bob's fingerprints are all over the murder scene. At first glance, that seems to be evidence of Bob's guilt, until the defense gets up and points out that the murder scene is Bob's break room at Bob's workplace, and Bob spends time in that room almost every day along with a bunch of other people. So the reason for the fingerprints could just be that Bob's normal activities at work lead to those fingerprints being there. It would be insane, it would be ridiculous for the prosecutor to come out and say, oh, well, yes, that's a plausible theory, but you have to do more than that. You have to show definitely that this is why the fingerprints are all over the place. And until you can show that, we should all just assume that he committed the murder. Like, no, that's ridiculous. If the prosecution is citing the fingerprints as evidence, they need to show why this other explanation is not acceptable, implausible, improbable, whatever. Similarly, if Dan is citing the census as evidence of Luke not knowing what he is talking about, or of Luke not being reliable, and so on and so forth, Dan has the burden of showing that these other explanations are implausible, or cannot be rationally accepted, or things like that, which he has not done. This strategy that we just saw Dan employ, this is his default strategy for a lot of his arguments and a lot of the stuff we're going to see today. He just assumes that his position is the correct one, and then he plays the skeptic against any alternative theories. This brings me to a second issue so far, which is that Dan doesn't seem to understand that when we are investigating historical issues, we have to account for all of the data in our theories. If I think Luke didn't commit an error, I have to account for Josephus's comments. If Dan thinks Luke did commit an error, then Dan needs to account for all of the data which indicates that Luke was a well-informed writer who used eyewitness sources and was intending to convey historical information in his writing. The explanation that IP provides is plausible and fits better with the evidence that suggests that Luke was a well-informed writer. So even if one thinks that this theory is plausible at best, the fact that it fits better with the other data that we have about Luke and Josephus can render it as a better explanation. Okay, so final comment before moving on. Luke is writing earlier than Josephus. Luke explicitly indicates that he consulted eyewitnesses in his prologues, and Luke in other areas displays detailed knowledge about the world during this time. We are epistemically justified in giving Luke the benefit of the doubt if we can find a plausible explanation for the supposed error. And this is what good historians do. This is what good scholars do. Good historians will look at two generally reliable sources, Luke and Josephus, and if there seems to be an error or contradiction between the two, they will try to find a plausible explanation of that data that isn't just, oh, well, this guy's a big dumb. He got this obvious fact wrong. Because a plausible harmonization is one which better explains the totality of the data. However, Dan is not interested in doing good history. Dan is interested in tearing down the Gospels, and so he just doubles down on Luke being wrong instead of following the evidence where it leads. And this is why Dan never engages with the data in that 40-minute clip that he just hand waves away.
But a big problem with this is that there was already a legate in Syria who was there until after Herod died. So the attempt to move this census into Herod's lifetime is precluded by other data.
Okay, so let's pause here and address this argument. So the objection that Dan is trying to get out here is that, hey, look, Luke says that Quirinius did this census, or this is the first census under Quirinius, or this is the first census done under Quirinius, or something like that. But during the time that IP is proposing, Quirinius was not the legate. So Dan's argument is that, hey, even if we grant IP's kind of chronological argument here, a big problem with this is Luke still got something wrong. Namely, he got wrong who is in charge overseeing this census. However, a number of scholars have argued that the text in Luke is not saying that this census was the first one that was conducted while Quirinius was governor, or was first conducted while Quirinius was governor. Rather, they argue that it is saying this census was conducted before Quirinius was governor. And if this is the case, then Dan's big problem is non-existent. I'm going to put a quote on screen from page 94 of Craig Blomberg's book, The Historical Reliability of the New Testament, in which he talks about this. If you're interested in a few more details about the Greek, you can pause the video and read it, but I'm going to keep trucking for the sake of time.
So at best, this is a plausibility stacked on a plausibility. More likely, it is just an implausibility, and this argument has not convinced the majority of scholars.
Alright, so several issues here. First, notice that Dan just asserts that this is likely an implausibility. He doesn't make any type of argument for it. He doesn't engage with any of the details put forth by Inspiring Philosophy. He doesn't talk about any arguments put forth in the paper that Inspiring Philosophy is drawing from. Second, Dan says this has not convinced the majority of scholars. Anytime Dan McClellan makes a claim about what the majority of scholars believe, you need to be asking the question, where does he get this sociological claim from? Was there a survey that polled all the scholars on their views? If so, can you point us to that poll? Can you point us to that survey? Is there a scholar who has, as an academic project, investigated where the majority of scholars stand on this topic? If so, can you point us to that source? Or does Dan make this claim because from the things he has read and the things he is engaged with, most scholars that he reads seem to hold to this position? If it is this final option, then Dan's justification for his making his claim, if that's his reason for it, we should by default doubt his claim about what the majority of scholars hold to. And the reason we should by default doubt his claim is Dan has made it abundantly clear that he does not engage with the content of scholars that do not share his ideological framework. Let me give you an example. Way back when I first started engaging with Dan McClellan, we had a back and forth about gospel authorship, and Dan made the claim that most scholars deny that Luke and Acts were written by the same author. Now that's just wrong, and in my interactions with him, I quoted from Craig Keener's massive 4-volume commentary on the book of Acts, in which Keener explicitly says most scholars think the opposite. For those of you who don't know, Craig Keener is an extremely prominent, well-respected biblical scholar with a very impressive resume. And as you might have guessed from the fact that he wrote a 4-volume commentary on the book of Acts, he is an expert on this area. He is an authority in that area. He's well read there. Dan is not. Dan is not an Acts scholar. He's not a Luke Acts scholar. So what did Dan do when faced with the fact that an actual expert on that area contradicted him? Dan's response was to just hand wave it away and dismiss Craig Keener as a scholar because Dan didn't like that the university or the college that Craig Keener worked at. He didn't like that the college had a statement of faith. That's not even an exaggeration. Dan has made it abundantly clear that he does not engage with any scholarship outside of his little bubble of what he considers critical scholarship. He just doesn't even factor it in. I don't even think he sits down and reads it. So his comments about the scholarly consensus, these are less than impressive. I would also note that even if we grant this point, we should ask an immediate follow-up question. Have the majority of scholars read the paper and considered the argument? Because if not, it doesn't really mean much that they haven't been convinced by a paper that they haven't read. But ultimately, the important thing is whether the argument in the paper is good, not how many scholars have read the paper or agree with it. Dan never actually addresses these arguments, so his video is significantly lacking in substance. But let's keep going.
The third issue can be resolved by looking at what Luke actually says. Harold Honer notes, Luke uses the present tense, indicating that Augustus ordered censuses to be taken regularly, rather than only one time. Thus, it is reasonable to believe that there was an order of a general census in the time of Augustus. Sir William Ramsay said, the decree of Augustus, which Luke mentions, is commonly interpreted as ordering that a single census should be held of the whole Roman world. This is not a correct interpretation of Luke's words. He uses the present tense, and he means that Augustus ordered enrollments to be regularly taken, according to the strict and proper usage of the present tense.
So, in citing two different publications, this creator gives the illusion of widespread scholarly agreement.
So there's nothing about this clip that insinuates that IP is trying to give the appearance of widespread scholarly agreement from him just citing two sources. Dan is swinging at arguments that are not there, and I think it's really ironic that Dan levies this argument against inspiring philosophy, considering Dan cites 0 sources in his response to IP. Dan makes assertions about what the general consensus of scholarship is, but yet Dan doesn't cite 2 sources. Dan doesn't even cite 1 sources. So maybe Dan should take his foot off the pedal a little bit here.
However, what they omit is that Honer only cites Ramsay, and Ramsay, writing in the late 1800s, doesn't cite anybody.
Alright, so let's pause here. So let's first note that Dan seems to attack the work cited by inspiring philosophy because one is old. But an argument being old doesn't mean it's bad. Dan also seems to insinuate that this argument, that this paper or a book by Ramsay should be dismissed because Ramsay is not citing anybody else in this. That's because Ramsay's doing original scholarly work in that thing that is being cited. So the fact that he isn't citing somebody else for it is irrelevant. We can engage with his arguments just by looking at them. We can take them on their own. So this idea that in order to use a source, it has to be cited from something. Well, okay, then whatever it's citing, that has to be citing from something. That's going to just go back infinitely. But then that's going to contradict Dan's argument that we shouldn't be using old sources. So, like, what's going on here? Sir William Ramsay is a highly respected scholar on this area. He did great work on this. That is still useful and pertinent to these questions today. And so Dan dismissing him because he's old, or dismissing him because, you know, he actually did original scholarly work on this area, these are not sufficient objections. He then attacks the other one because it only cited the old source, the William Ramsay source. However, two issues here. One, merely citing an old source doesn't mean it's wrong. Again, if we did that, that would contradict Dan's other argument about, oh, well, Ramsay didn't cite anybody. It's worth noting that in making his argument, Hoffner does not just cite Ramsay. I don't know why Dan is suggesting this is the case. Dan is either didn't double check the source that he's attacking here, or he's maybe intentionally misleading his audience. I think it's probably that he was just being sloppy and he didn't double check this. Hoffner cites several works in arguing for his position. One of these is A.N. Sherwin-White, who was a Roman historian. Hoffner cites Sherwin-White's book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. And in that book, if we flip to the citation that Hoffner is citing from, we see this. One phrase in Luke that has commonly been regarded as an error may bear a vastly different interpretation. An edict went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world was to be taxed, and this first happened when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Critics hasten to remark correctly that there never was a single census of the whole Roman Empire. The assessment of the different provinces was undertaken at different and widely separated dates in the Principate of Augustus. But Luke has been misunderstood. A census or taxation assessment of the whole provincial empire, excluding kingdoms, was certainly accomplished for the first time in history under Augustus. Now, it was the way of Augustus to issue general explanations of the particular actions of the central government. For example, in 4 BC, an amendment to the extortion law was issued to all provinces with the introductory formula that it may be plain to all those who dwell in the provinces what care we take that none of those who are subject to us should suffer harm, we enact as follows. It is likely that Quirinius issued the instructions for the census of Judea with an introductory edict of Augustus, explaining that whereas the welfare of the whole empire requires that no man should pay more than his due, and that the census should be completed throughout all the provinces, this is now to be undertaken in Judea at the same time as the revision of the census in Syria, or words to that effect. The supposed weakness in Luke's formulation may turn out to be the best proof of his accuracy. His whole statement means that the general policy of Augustus was carried out piecemeal in Judea in AD 6 by Quirinius. So what we see here is a Roman historian being cited to support the claim that Hoffner was making and the claim that Inspiring Philosophy was making. Now, I do want to comment that in that citation that I just read to you, Sherwin-White is going with the interpretation that that Luke is insinuating that this was taken under Quirinius. I don't think there's any reason that we need to hold as incompatible the earlier remarks and the citation I put up about Craig Blomberg regarding this was taken before Quirinius. I think we can take that interpretation and combine that also with what Sherwin-White is saying here. These are not incompatible. But some of my readers may have picked up on the fact that in that last quote, Sherwin-White is adopting that interpretation that Luke is saying that this was done under Quirinius. So I did want to point that out and make that obvious, because if I didn't, I'm sure somebody would have been in the comments saying, oh, your sources contradict. But anyways, let's keep on rocking and rolling.
Now, is this a possible sense of the present tense? Absolutely. There are a number of different ways the present tense could be used, and this is one possible sense. Are there any data that indicate we should give preference to this sense over any other? Absolutely not.
Okay, so again, notice here that Dan's rhetorical strategy is he says that there is no data to indicate that this is the sense being used. But wait a second. Dan is assuming that the interpretation he has is the correct and default one, and then he is trying to put the burden on Inspiring Philosophy to show that this other meaning is the probable one. However, this is just a rhetorical sleight of hand. If there is no data indicating that the interpretation IP provided is the more probable one, that does not mean Dan's interpretation is therefore the correct one, because then we could just turn around and ask Dan the exact same question that he asked IP. We could say, okay, Dan, is there data to indicate that your interpretation is more probable than IP's? If Dan can't do that, then that would just mean that Dan's explanation has no more reason to to be preferred over the one IP offered. If this is the case, the mere presence of an alternative interpretation that is equally likely with Dan's view serves as an undercutting defeater for Dan's argument. Dan is making the argument, and for Dan's argument to go through, he needs to show that inspiring philosophy's proposed interpretation is less likely than the one Dan is adopting. If Dan can't do that, his argument fails. But rather than taking his burden of proof on himself, Dan does this rhetorical maneuvering where he establishes himself as the default and demands that everybody else prove that theirs is more likely. This is why I maintain that much of Dan's content is bad philosophy masquerading as good scholarship. The overwhelming number of people who watch these videos by Dan are not going to be able to notice these little rhetorical moves that he's making. And it's worth noting that Dan is wrong to assert that no data indicates that this interpretation is the correct one. He is wrong to assert this because when we look at the totality of Luke's work, both in his gospel and in Acts, which is also written by him, what we see is that Luke was a well-informed historian who was diligent and careful with his sources, and he was writing about a time and a culture in which he was closely connected. If that is the case, it's more likely that Luke didn't just blunder a basic aspect of history. The very fact that this would result in Luke being egregiously and obviously wrong is itself the evidence for thinking that Luke probably meant it in the way that Hoffner and Sherwin White suggested. Their suggestion is not ad hoc, it's not implausible, it's completely reasonable, and it fits better with what we know about Luke as a writer and what we know about the ancient world. The only reason Dan is gung-ho about denying this interpretation is because if he denies this, if he recognizes that, yeah, this is a plausible interpretation that inspiring philosophy is offering, if he recognizes that, then Dan would be losing one of his favorite ways to bash the gospel.
So basically what we have is an apologetic assertion from the 1800s that is then repeated by somebody in the 20th century. That's not really strong evidence of anything.
The next supposed issue assumes Augustus would not have conducted a census in vassal kingdoms like that of Herod the Great. But there aren't any good reasons to support this assumption. Herod was essentially a puppet king, and Rome could do what they wanted. Sabine Hubner highlights a passage from Tacitus where a census was conducted in a client kingdom, and because of it, Rome had to deal with a revolt. So this suggests Rome could, and did at times, conduct censuses in client kingdoms, and there was no reason to assume they could not have done something similar within the kingdom of Judea.
Okay, I just want to pause here and make sure we all understand what's going on. So the question at hand is whether Augustus would have compelled Herod to take a census. With the idea that someone, Dan, would want to raise is, hey, listen, Herod had his own authority and autonomy. He would have been left alone. So this claim by Luke is unlikely. So first thing to note here is that if somebody like Dan is bringing up this argument as an objection to Luke, they need to support the assertion that Augustus would never do this. They need to show why this should be doubted. It's not enough to sit back and play the skeptic and demand proof that this type of thing was, unlikely. Dan's methodology is to assume that Luke is a liar, and then unless you can prove that Luke isn't a liar, we all have to assume he's a liar as well. However, inspiring philosophy has sought to produce such a data point that would show that this actually is likely, this isn't abnormal, and he's doing this by referencing actions that indicate that the Romans have exercise this type of relationship with those under them, that they've done something kind of similar in this instance that's recited by Tacitus. So then IP then cites this example from Tacitus in which it is reasonable to infer that the Romans were imposing a census on them. Now Dan thinks this inference is mistaken. So let's see what Dan's argument is for his rejection of inspiring philosophy's example here.
So this is some more rhetorical misdirection. This creator wants you to believe that this account describes Rome requiring a client kingdom to conduct a census, and there are absolutely no data whatsoever that indicate that. The overwhelming, pretty much unilateral consensus of classicists who study this.
All right, everybody, so there's that claim. We have a sociological claim by Dan, and what do we ask when Dan makes sociological claims? We ask him where he's getting that sociological data from. Dan is not an expert on Tacitus. This is not within his field of expertise, so he needs to back up this claim with support for his sociological claim, or at bare minimum, at least, cite some classicists at this point who would back him up on rejecting IP's inference. However, Dan has done none of that, so let's keep watching.
Is that this census originated with the client king himself. He made the decision to conduct the census. He tried to conduct it in Roman fashion, When Rome does something, you don't say they did it in Roman fashion. You only say that of folks who are not Rome.
All right, so let's go ahead and pause here. Dan asserts that it was the king himself who is the origin of the census, but Dan offers no evidence for this assertion. It seems like the only actual data point that he's trying to cite in order to support that claim is that the language of in Roman fashion is not likely to be used if the Romans forced this. However, there's no reason to think Dan's claim here is correct, like at all. If the Romans forced them to do a census, it makes perfect sense for Tacitus to say they were compelled to do this in Roman fashion. There is nothing about this language that renders inspiring philosophy's claim improbable, and all Dan has done is make assertions with no evidence and no citation. And I do want to draw to people's attention that inspiring philosophy is citing his sources. He is putting quotes from experts on the screen, and he's telling you where to check his info from. Dan ain't doing this. Dan rarely does this. Back when I first argued with Dan on gospel authorship, I regularly cited experts in the field, and Dan cited little to no scholars to back him up. Inspiring philosophy is exhibiting the virtues of scholarship more than Dan is, but let's keep tracking.
And then this group rebelled, and it was only then that Rome had to become involved to send troops in to defend their client kingdom from this rebellion. This is not evidence in any way, shape, or form whatsoever that Rome compelled client kingdoms to conduct censuses. They didn't. There are no data that support the notion that they did.
We have no data that they did, so long as we don't take into account the first century historical work that explicitly testifies that they did this. This, though there is no data argument, only works if you assume from the start that the historical work of the book of Luke isn't a data point, which it is. Dan is assuming Luke is wrong. Dan is assuming Luke is a liar in order to make this argument. It's also worth noting that we have additional data which supports the idea of Augustus exercising this type of authority over a client kingdom. For instance, Hoffner notes in his work that another indication, this is a quote from Hoffner, quote, another indication of Augustus's role in the finances of client kingdoms occurs when Herod's domain was divided among his 3 sons. Augustus ordered that the Samaritans' taxes should be reduced by 1/4 because they had not revolted against Varus. And this was before Samaria became a part of a Roman province. Hence, it is seen that the Roman emperor became involved in taking censuses in the vassal kingdoms, end quote. Second, we know that while maybe sure Herod normally exercised autonomy, Josephus tells us that Herod and Augustus had a falling out. Augustus wrote a letter to Herod saying that while I used to treat you as a friend, now I'm going to treat you as a subject. And we see that in Josephus's Antiquities. So it's a bit crazy for Dan to say, oh, well, Herod had autonomy and Augustus would just never overstep that autonomy, when Augustus explicitly says, I'm going to start treating you as a subject now. Now, Herod got back into Augustus's favor later, but the timing of this falling out is close enough to the ordering of the census that it's reasonable to infer that the census was issued during this time of dispute. So to summarize this point, there's just nothing inherently implausible about Augustus being involved in Herod's kingdom in this way. It fits everything we know of what was going on during this time, and since we have a well-informed first century historical document attesting to it, we are justified in taking that testimony as valid.
And appealing to this text is rhetorical misdirection.
Roger Bagnall and Bruce Fryer note that throughout the reign of Augustus, there were 6 censuses conducted in Egypt. So Luke's suggestion that another one was conducted in Judea fits right in and would align with Augustus's desire to perform multiple censuses so he could have accurate records.
Egypt was not a client kingdom, and these censuses were for taxation purposes. Client kings were required to take care of taxation themselves, and as long as they were paying an adequate amount to the Roman Empire, they were left alone. And additionally, if there had been a census ordered of Judea while Herod was king, it would not have been Quirinius. It would have been Publius Quintilius Varus, who was the legate in Syria until after Herod's death.
Okay, so I want to pause here briefly just to note that I already addressed that claim about Varus being the legate. I addressed that earlier, so don't need to go over that again here. And then I just want to point out that it seems like to suggest that the stuff that inspiring philosophy is referenced here, he's just kind of saying, hey, listen, we see something similar over here. Like this is not to say, oh, listen, this is exactly the same thing, like, type for type. This is saying, oh, look, we see this type of behavior, so we maybe have precedent for this happening. And so I don't think Dan's remarks here are really, just by saying, oh, well, this is a difference here, they're not this or they're not that. Like Dan doesn't seem to be getting the point of the argument. Where inspiring philosophy is saying, listen, if we look at the context of this culture and everything that's going on here, like this type of behavior is just this isn't strongly against standard operating procedure of the Roman world at that time. But anyways, this is all just minor comments. Let's keep going to the last. I think this is the upcoming thing as the last major point. We'll see if I'm right about that.
What about the first issue? Is it incorrect for Luke to record that Jews had to travel to their place of origin for a census? Well, first off, we need to note there are no sources to contradict Luke on this issue. So to say he is wrong because it is not confirmed elsewhere is to argue from silence.
No, it's an argument from reason, because it is entirely irrational and implausible that the Roman Empire ground portions of its economy to a halt for weeks at a time to require that chunks of its population go spend money to travel to some other part of the empire so that they could be registered in their ancestral hometown for no reason at all.
Okay, so there's a couple comments to be made here. First off, notice that in this clip, Inspiring Philosophy starts out by saying, if Luke says that this happened, then objecting to this by saying, oh, well, we don't see this elsewhere, that's an argument from silence. And then Dan says, no, it's not an argument from silence, but then Dan just makes a completely separate argument. Like, the argument which Dan is trying to come in and say, oh, listen, here's the reason we should reject that, that's a different argument from what Inspiring Philosophy was saying would be an argument from silence. So this is just odd to start out with. Second off, it's worth noting that Dan is making a lot of presumptions here. Dan is making presumptions about, oh, well, this would have caused, these entire sections of the Roman province to just grind to a halt. He's making these kind of large, kind of dramatic claims, but there's just no reason to think that the type of census that is being suggested by Inspiring Philosophy would have resulted in something like that. This is just over-exaggeration on Dan's part. Or he would need to show, he needs to show with data, not merely his dogma, that if we were to take the idea that Inspiring Philosophy is proposing, that it would result in entire large sections of the economy grinding to a halt.
If you want to make the case that that happened, you need data to support it. And no, you can't prove it didn't happen is not that data.
Jews were tied to their families and still considered to be under their fathers, more so than in other cultures.
So here this creator is constructing an argument that the biblical text is wrong to say that Joseph traveled to Bethlehem because he was of the house of David. Rather, the text should have said that Joseph traveled to Bethlehem because his father lived in Bethlehem and Joseph was still a part of his father's household. He was not independently living in Nazareth. He was just there for work or something. So we're ginning up scenarios that are not in evidence in order to allow us to skirt the data. So at the very best, this is just a slim plausibility. I would argue that this is something that's not impossible, but there are absolutely no data that support this ginned up scenario.
We can find a parallel in the neighboring territory of Egypt. A papyrus that dates to 104 AD states that the prefect of Egypt ordered Egyptians to return to their place of origin so the census could be carried out.
So this papyrus is talking about people who are temporarily away from their home for work. It's not talking about returning to an ancestral place of origin. And as I've already discussed, the notion that Joseph traveled to Bethlehem because his actual home was in Bethlehem and he was still a part of his father's household there is not supported by any data. It actually directly contradicts the text itself, which says the reason he went to Bethlehem is because he was of the lineage of the house of David.
So there is nothing.
Now, when it comes to why is it the case that they would potentially need to go back, I'm just going to be lazy and read another quote from Hoffner here because he spells it out pretty well. Hoffner says, quote, Roman law states that the property owner had to register for taxation in the district in which his land was situated. But there is a papyrus of AD 104 where the prefect of Egypt ordered Egyptians to return to their home so that the census might be carried out. Since the Jews' property was the property of the father's estates, the Romans would comply to the custom of laying claim to one's family estate in order to assess it for taxation. Every person needed to appear to be questioned mentioned so as to make a proper assessment of his property. Because of this, Mary would have needed to go, end quote. Now, Hoffner goes on to suggest some other aspects. I'm not going to get into those, but the idea here that inspiring philosophy is getting at by noting the connection between one's family, this is all relevant to what Hoffner is saying. And none of this contradicts the statement that the Bible makes, about Luke makes, about, well, the reason he needed to go is because of his lineage to David. Because him having lineage from David, that's not separate from any land that his family had or any property that his family had that would be going to him or that he inherited or things along those lines. These are not mutually exclusive. These are not implausible. This is all pretty straightforward. This is consistent with what we know about the ancient world. So Dan is just doing a lot of foot stomping, and he's trying to make it sound as if, inspiring philosophy is just ginning up all these things, whereas inspiring philosophy is quite rightly noting that these things that we're seeing in Luke are consistent with what we're seeing in the ancient world. And so Dan is the one, if he wants to say Luke is wrong and he wants to stomp his foot about that, Dan needs to show that these suggestions that inspiring philosophy or Hoffner or White or any of these other, Sherwin White or any of these other people are making are somehow implausible. But Dan hasn't actually done that.
Nothing out of the ordinary by Luke recording that Joseph and Mary needed to travel to Bethlehem for the census, which is probably where Joseph's father resided.
So there are absolutely no data whatsoever that make it probable that Joseph's father lived in Bethlehem and that Joseph was still a part of his father's household and so traveled to Bethlehem because that was his actual home.
Is there any data which renders it improbable, Dan? Because if not, there's no reason not to postulate this as an explanatory mechanism for understanding the text in Luke. You need to do more than foot stomp and say, well, you haven't proved it. You have work to do here as well, Dan.
That is brought up as a possibility, and then because that is the possibility that preserves the integrity and the historicity of the account, this creator then just asserts that that's probably what happened.
And that is a perfectly fine response. Dan thinks that if we're looking at a text and we say, why does this text say this? Dan thinks we should default to any interpretation that makes the text in error. Whereas inspiring philosophy is about to note, in general, that is not how we should operate with people. We should have a principle of charity. And so if we're looking at a piece of data and we say, why is this the case? We can infer plausible things, be like, oh, maybe that's why they did that. We do this all the time in our daily life. We do it in history, we do it in forensics, we do it in our daily life. Like, if I'm trying to discover why did this happen and I'm thinking of explanations, I was like, okay, well, this explanation explains this data. I don't then necessarily have to have some extra data which supports that explanation which I'm positing. Just the fact that that explanation explains all of the data, which, remember, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find explanations which explain all of the data, not just the data in Luke 2, but all of the data that we see in Luke and in Acts and in Josephus and all the Roman world. Just the fact that this has great explanatory power, that is in and of itself justification for adopting that explanation.
So once we study the cultural and historical context and treat Luke as innocent until proven guilty, there is nothing erroneous in the text. As long as we apply the principle of charity, this supposed error can be resolved.
So this video is taking a pretty standard apologetic approach to these concerns. And that approach is not to argue that their position is most likely.
Just going to pause here and say the principle of charity is a standard approach for responsible scholars in a variety of fields, whether it be philosophy, history, science, biblical studies, whatever. Just in general, in our everyday life, the principle of charity is a good thing. It's something that we should be using. So if you have a statement by someone and you have two explanations of that statement, one statement would render them a buffoon and the other statement would render them, just saying something normal, like not buffoonery. And those two statements are equally plausible. They're equally probable. Like nothing makes one, more or less plausible than the other. The principle of charity would say, yeah, we should just be charitable and assume it's the non-buffoonery explanation. There's nothing wrong with this.
It's not to generate data that indicate their position is most likely. It is to begin from the presupposition that their position is correct and then try to show that that is not impossible.
So I want to note here that it's really interesting, and by interesting I mean ironic, that Dan is making this critique because Dan presumes his position is the default. Dan thinks that Luke is a liar. Like he thinks that Luke gets this wrong. So we have two interpretations of this text. And Dan thinks that the data that we're all skirting is the fact that Luke gets something wrong. But what we're doing is we're disputing the fact that that is even data which points in that direction. And that's what Dan doesn't get. Dan comes to the table with the default assumption that this data points to this. And then as soon as we point out, well, like, no, actually that data doesn't point to that. That data can point to a lot of different directions. Dan gets mad and he just stomps his feet and says, oh, well, you're skirting the data. Like, this is just methodologically sloppy, and it's just really ironic that he gets so bent out of shape about how we're supposedly assuming a position. Well, listen, I employ a charitable methodology in general to the historical works that I approach, including historical works that don't come from my religious traditions, which is if I have a person who's offering testimony about things they've experienced, or if I have a historical work which is offering testimony that they've gotten from eyewitness sources or other sources in that time that are reliable, my default is not to assume that that person's a liar. And that doesn't just go for Christian sources, that goes for all sources. I try to hold myself to this same standard when it comes to things like Islam, and that's why I don't make some arguments that I see other people make when it comes to things about Muhammad. And so this isn't a problem.
And so if you need to believe the conclusion, this video gives you reasons to feel like it is possible, or maybe in a couple cases that it is plausible. This video is not showing what's most likely, and it's misrepresenting a lot of the data that it is presenting.
All right, so here we are at the end. So again, Dan says that we have not presented data to show that this is the case. All we've done is show that it's possible. That is not true. Inspiring Philosophy and both myself in this video responding it have noted scholarly works which give context to the world in which Luke is writing in, and have noted that there are other interpretations that are no less plausible, no less probable than the interpretation that Dan is positing, which is that Luke is a big dumb liar. And I would point out that our interpretation is more plausible, it's more likely, because it presents a more cohesive picture of the author of Luke. The way that we are interpreting Luke 2 is consistent with the well-informed, careful nuance that the author of Luke Acts shows in other works. And additionally, we are displaying a charitable approach to historical works, which should be the default. Now, the reason that this principle of charity is so foreign to Dan is he operates within a methodological tradition within biblical studies, which is to be hypercritical of every single written document until you can show without a shadow of a doubt that it's the case otherwise. So whereas I take the position that if, hey, I have someone who tells me that they were there and they experienced this, I have someone giving me testimony about, a work, or if I have a historical document that's saying, hey, listen, I investigated this issue, I've talked to eyewitnesses, here's what's going on, I think that that testimony, and this isn't just for religious stuff, this is in general, that testimony is innocent until proven guilty. And this is how we all usually operate in our everyday world. We take testimony, especially testimony about people's experiences in the world, to be innocent until proven guilty. However, Dan is adopting an epistemology of testimony which denies that testimony is innocent until proven guilty. He's taking a position which implies that all testimony is guilty until proven innocent. And so this is ironic because when it comes to Luke, he'll say, oh, well, Luke is wrong because it contradicts Josephus over here. But then he's assuming that Josephus is innocent, or he's assuming this other guy is innocent. And so all of the historical sources that Dan is going to draw on to try to attack the veracity of Luke, those are sources which he is himself assuming are innocent. He's not applying that same methodological standard to. And what's funny is if Dan was to try to come in and he's going to say, well, oh, I think Josephus is right, and then he thinks he can cite other sources to back up Josephus, his methodology is going to bite him in the butt, because now every single thing that he cites to support Josephus, he has to assume those are all guilty until proven innocent as well. So if you want to be consistent with this methodology of all testimony has to be taken as guilty till proven innocent, we can never use testimony at all, because we're just going to be constantly going down this rabbit hole of like, okay, I've got this testimony, I can justify it with these guys. Oh wait, I have to show they're not guilty of lying, so then I have to use these other guys that corroborate what they say. Oh, but now I have all these more guys and I have to support them. Rather, the simple intuitive way that we all engage with testimony, and how I think most historians, I mean, I don't have a sociological, claim to back this up, but I think the most ways that historians approach ancient works that aren't the Bible, that don't have the, ideological issues associated with the Bible, is they approach these works with the principle of charity, which is this is innocent until proven guilty. And if I have what appears to be an otherwise well-read, reliable source, and he seems to say something that's odd, I don't just default to calling him a big dum-dum. I default to saying, okay, is there a plausible interpretation which maintains the integrity of the source? IP has showed this. The scholars that he has cited have showed this. Dan is just frustrated. Dan is upset by the fact that he is trying to make an argument against the reliability of the Gospels. He does this often. Dan wants to undermine the reliability of the Gospels. He does this by trying to point to errors in Luke. He does this by trying to point to issues in traditional authorship. And when people like me come out, or people like IP come out, and we note that there are issues in the arguments putting forth, Dan just goes to the traditional strategy of, oh, we're just these apologists who are we're just making up excuses because we need this to be the case. No, we're engaging in critical thought, and we're recognizing that the data which you are claiming points to a conclusion does not point to that conclusion, and is actually in many instances inconsistent with other data. I've been rambling on this last point for a little bit. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this. I am working on other projects not super related to biblical studies right now, so this is the first thing I've done responding to Dan in a while. I don't know if I'll do others soon, but feel free to request it. I may or may not do it. Everybody have a great day.